Good evening, everyone. I'm Matthew Gibson, Executive Director of Virginia Humanities, the state's Humanities Council. And I'm honored to welcome you to Democracy 360's closing program, Stories That Bind Us, a conversation with Beth Macy. I'm especially proud to represent Virginia Humanities as a producing partner of this evening's conversation. Tonight's program is a celebration of storytelling, and it's also a reflection of our mission to connect people and ideas that explore the human experience. Through programs and grant making for the last 50 years, Virginia Humanities has supported storytelling to strengthen community, connecting people to one another and to the places where they live and they work, to the places they call home. Stories are essential to democracy. At their best, they can help us see through another's eyes and to cultivate the empathy needed to find common ground that is often and unfortunately hard to find in our pluralistic nation. Stories invite us into different perspectives, many different than our own, and they remind us that community depends on understanding as much as it depends upon debate. Beth Macy's career has embodied that truth. From her acclaimed books like Factory Girl and Dopesick to her new memoir, Paper Girl, Beth has brought the voices of overlooked communities into the national conversation. Her work as a journalist highlights another essential truth, that journalism is a vital form of storytelling, indispensable for a healthy democracy. In fact, Virginia Humanities and the Karsh Institute recently studied the local news ecosystem across the Commonwealth because strong journalism is a cornerstone of a thriving democracy and a priority that we're excited to continue to pursue together. Joining Beth in conversation is Melody Barnes, Executive Director of the Karsh Institute. The Institute's work is rooted in bringing people together across perspectives to generate solutions and ideas that strengthen democracy. Melody, of course, embodies that spirit, and we're grateful to have her here to guide tonight's conversation. So please join me in welcoming Beth Macy and Melody Barnes.
It's wonderful to be with all of you for this final session. And Beth, it is particularly gratifying and wonderful to be here with you. I have, in preparing for this session, have just been immersing and re-immersing myself in your work. And I think I can probably speak for everyone in this auditorium when I say thank you for the body of work that you have done. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much.
I also think that the topic that we'll talk about tonight through the lens of your work is one that is really meaningful for people right now and something that people are curious about, eager for, not quite sure how to address. What does bind us together and how do we move forward together? And just recently, as we've been preparing for Democracy 360 in this session, we've been having conversations with you, and there's something that you said in one of those conversations that I thought was just really, really beautiful, and I want to start our conversation with that. You said, "We are educated, entertained, and enriched when we disappear into the lives of others, and that makes us better citizens." And I'm curious, as a reporter, as a writer, how you see storytelling, especially stories about people and places that are often forgotten, how those stories help us to think about our democracy.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Melody, and to Democracy 360. I have been basically a newspaper feature writer for most of my career, and I loved it. I thought I should be paying them for the experience to get to go out and learn all these interesting things. I'm basically a nosy person at heart. And then to get to come back and present it to readers. And when I first started at the Roanoke Times in 1989, we had a circulation of 125,000. We were the highest penetration rate paper in the nation. And I was able to go out and report on all kinds of stories, not just investigative pieces, but like empathy building stories Like, I wrote about this young woman who wasn't just the first in her neighborhood to go to college, first in her family to go to college. She was the first in her neighborhood to go, and she went to Harvard. And I followed that story for 6 years. And when the first article ran, it was called Library's Child, because she had basically been raised by a single mom with the help of the head librarian at this predominantly African American branch library called Gainsborough. You know, it was just this delightful moment to witness people celebrating her. And when the story ran, a hairdresser in town who was gay and white started a fund for her where he collected donations at the hair salon, and so she wouldn't have to worry about spending money. Yeah, so she could be just like everybody else. And I remember the first time her mother visited her at Harvard, she was in JFK's old dorm, and they slept head to feet in a twin bed, you know? And it's so, and like one of her roommates was the daughter of an Italian ambassador.
That's such a beautiful story. I remember reading about this and how the people in the library who would see this little girl come through and grow up there broke into tears when they found out that she was their child.
Yes, yes. And the moment she got into Harvard, it was like April 1st or whatever, and everybody knew she was getting into all these colleges, and there were old men who put down the newspapers they were reading and they wept for history. And a lot of these were people who had led the charge during the civil rights movement, and they were so proud of her. And by the way, she now runs a library in Christiansburg, Virginia, and owns a house around the corner from me. And so we started out by saying how many people worked at or how many papers we sold every day. I mean, the paper is now a shadow of its former self. It had 60 some reporters when I came in 1989, and now has 6. And we do have 2 online startups. We have the Roanoke Rambler and Cardinal News, and they both do a great job. But if you put them all together, it's about a third of what we once had. And we were a scrappy paper that punched above its weight. And the truth is, we don't even know what we're missing, right? Because those stories, and particularly those empathy-building stories, like the story about Selena Sullivan, I just worry that leaves this gaping hole where we don't know as much about our neighbors as we used to. And then when you layer the internet and the algorithm on top of that, you get into some really dark spaces with conspiracy theories.
And that beautiful story about Selena highlights the story of and tells us something about community and how these stories tell us who we are as community members and what we have in common. People helping people that they may not ever have otherwise known about. Do you also think that storytelling helps tell us something about who we are as a country, moving that kind of this broader audience, this larger national community?
Yes, and what's of particular concern, I think, is just the lack of news in small communities and rural areas. Our national news is basically manufactured in cities, and rare is the New York or Washington reporter that goes out to a place like Martinsville, Virginia, and writes about how they've had the highest unemployment rate for a decade, right? And then how 10 years later, Purdue Pharma and other pharmaceutical companies purposely target these areas that have high rates of workplace injuries and high rates of Medicaid, so they can sell the pills. And people don't know what they don't know, and that just further pushes people to the corners in their silos, and has created so much resentment in rural America, which has disproportionately paid for the successes of urban America, I would argue.
And we see those kinds of resentments and the lack of knowledge, community over community, place over place, rural and urban. People don't understand or believe they don't understand or have anything in common with people that are in other parts of the country or places that they've never been because there's no connective tissue.
Right. And you even see families start to come apart, like in the case of my own family.
Right. And I want to talk about that in a minute. There's the section when you were just talking, there's a piece of your writing in Paper Girl, and you say political fever is heightened with the near constant barrage of national cable news, usually spun by left or right-leaning media and amplified by taunting tweets. As Craigslist, Google, and Facebook usurped most of what newspapers counted on for ad revenue, my beloved industry cratered in all but urban power centers. Non-city people like John began identifying more with national politics and less with their geographic communities and the kinds of shared narratives that once dominated newspapers, including feature stories that explained who your neighbors were and sometimes who you were, warts and all.
Yeah, yeah.
That cratering of local journalism that you were just talking about, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about what happened and why you see that as such an essential missing component to a thriving democracy.
Yeah. Well, I talk in the book about the end of the Fairness Doctrine, which went away under Reagan, and that was the...
So you can explain that a little
Yeah,
bit?
the law that made it so that if there was an editorial on TV, there would have to be a countervailing view of that point. And that sort of paved the way for people like Rush Limbaugh to take over the airwaves. And so suddenly, John, that she just mentioned, is my brother-in-law, and had been a Reagan Republican from California, and everything was fine. We never talked politics in the 80s and 90s, and then in the early aughts, or the early teens, I would come home to visit the family, and I would say, "How you doing, John?" And he would say, "Deplorable," and suddenly all our conversations got really, really tense, and my sister would have to intervene and say, we already discussed this, no politics. And so it becomes possible for John, living in his small town of Enon, Ohio, to not know anything about the opioid crisis, for instance, because his little newspaper doesn't cover it. And he finds out there's an opioid crisis because he's at his public library and somebody overdoses in the next stall. This is 2017.
And you mean literally in the next stall?
Literally in the next stall, and he was all shook up, and I'm like, yeah. So just, it's not just the news you can use and how to support, the local fire station with their fundraiser and who got a DUI last week and all this kind of stuff that my family read the paper religiously. We watched Walter Cronkite. It's also the empathy building stories and these, we used to call them enterprise stories, where you would, like one time in 1993, for some reason, Roanoke had the highest rate of teen pregnancy in the state of Virginia. And my editor was just like, why would Roanoke have the highest rate? And so they let me spend a year writing about teen pregnancy. And I wrote a series of stories that I would, like 1 or 2 a month for a whole year. And the result of that was the city really began to take it seriously, and they started a task force, and the rate actually went down.
So your writing and your reporting was actually the catalyst to greater knowledge and a community doing work to help and try and solve its problems.
Exactly. An example, Roanoke was really a good paper. We had a Pulitzer-winning writer from Philadelphia who did the series on how the pesticide industry was not regulated. It changed laws in Virginia. Her work saved lives. And there's just no capacity for that kind of work unless you're the New York Times, basically.
And you've referenced a couple of times the opioid crisis. And my guess is so many people here have read Dopesick or seen the movie, watched the series. Talk some about the way that crisis all of a sudden emerged, and because there wasn't the storytelling, because there weren't ways for people to identify a problem that was almost like mist kind of moving in until it emerged as a full-blown problem, and literally people were losing their children, their siblings, their spouses.
Yeah, so I wrote the book Factory Man. It came out in 2014, and as I was finishing up the reporting on it, I'm embedded in this city of Martinsville that I mentioned earlier, and Bassett, Virginia, and Galax, Virginia. But I started hearing, like, we have heroin in Martinsville, Virginia. I'm like, what? Heroin? And I wrote the book. I went back to the paper for a short time, and there was this big story that blew up because it arose in the courts and police, which the paper was still covering at the time. And basically, these two wealthy kids that went to private school in Roanoke one died of an overdose, and the other was about to go to federal prison for 5.5 years for having sold the heroin that killed the other young man's life. And it was huge news. And my editor said, I mean, we reported it. We reported when he got sentenced and all this. But my editor at the time said, I want you to do a series on this, explaining how we got here. And it was everything from the unleashing of OxyContin, but also the fact that because we had unleashed these unregulated pill mills and everybody had leftover opioids in their medicine cabinets, and kids started taking advantage of that and started getting addicted. And that was going on, and my editor said, look, if we can just, the only goal then was to write this 3-part series about what had happened, how these two families had been turned asunder by these pills, and it wasn't yet a heroin crisis. And if we can just convince people to properly dispose of their pills, we will have saved lives. And that was great. So we did this piece. I go back to my publisher and I say, I want to do so these are my agent and my editor in New York, and I say, I just did this 3-part series. You know, I had wrapped up Factory Man. I think this should be my second book. And they went, heroin? And this is what, 2014? I'm like, yeah, heroin. And they're like, they hadn't seen it in their lives. And they said, Roanoke's just late getting it, like it was a trend or something. You know, it was like it was fashion. And I'm like, I don't think so. But I hadn't yet published a book, and I didn't really have the social capital. Meanwhile, the economists Ann Case and Angus Deaton prove, you know, within decimal points, that American life expectancy is going down for the first time since World War I, and it's mostly because of overdoses. So I go back, and meanwhile I had written a second book, but I went back and I used that as ammunition to write about, to write the book Dopesick, and I followed kind of the story from the introduction of OxyContin in 1996, how the pills got harder to get, just as those two young men I was writing about were struggling to get it and were going to heroin, and now what we have is a fentanyl and methamphetamine crisis. But we were so late getting to it because we weren't paying any attention to what was happening in rural America. Not to say that it wasn't happening elsewhere, but it was more noticeable there. And because it was laid on top, almost you could pin one map on top of the other, it was laid on top of these already suffering communities, it was more dire.
And one of the things that you write about, and I'm hesitating because I'm toggling mentally between across your books, but heroin had been perceived as, you know, that happens in urban communities. That's Charlie Parker. That's happening in African American communities. It's not happening here. And at the same time, as it is happening in rural America, it hadn't hit suburban America, and people just either didn't know or didn't care, thought it might happen someplace else, but not to us. So in other words, the connective tissue, the understanding that this was all of our problem hadn't hit yet.
Yeah, and the people who had the money in the suburbs, like these two families I'm talking about, you know, they were private school families, and there was so much shame about it that they had the money to hide what was happening. They could send their kids off to rehab, but they didn't tell their neighbors about it, right? So the opioid, the crisis grows unchecked and unabated due to shame. And so that's really, I was so grateful when Hulu made the show, because more people watch TV than read books, alas. But I was so grateful that we were able to tell this story that reached millions of people, to put the onus on who the real bad guys were. It's not your cousin that's in jail because of selling a user amount of weed or whatever, who works at Subway. It's this family of millionaires that wanted to be billionaires, that purposely lied to the nation, and the politicians that took their money and let it happen.
And this is I'm hesitating. I don't want to use the word perfect example, but it's clearly an example of place where we have common shared problems, and the stories and the knowledge of those problems can help bind us together and potentially help us understand how we need to face those challenges. And I think similarly with Factory Man, this is a book, and this is a set of stories about dislocation, about offshoring, about economic upheaval, and what that meant to your hometown, what that meant to your family. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the first time I was doing the interviews for the series that led to Factory Man, I was interviewing a woman who had just been laid off by Stanley Furniture, which was one of the last big furniture factories to close in Henry County, which had once been the factory floor for the state of Virginia. And, she gave me her phone number for a follow-up call, and then she said, here, you better take my mom's phone number because my phone's about to be cut off. And I remember what that felt like, because my mom had also been a dislocated factory worker, and we also struggled with utility cutoff notices and poverty and, possible homelessness. And I just saw that story wasn't being told from the ground up. You might get it from the political point of view. At the same time, the recession was happening, and we know because Pew Center did a survey when the 08 to 12 recession happened, only 2% of the stories, again, manufactured by the cities, actually featured people that were hurt by the recession. Most of them were told from the point of view of CEOs and business folks. And, so much suffering just went unremarked upon. And
unnoticed.
Yeah.
And so over this set of books, over the course of your work, Factory Man, Dopesick, now Paper Girl, you are consistently talking about challenges that are distributed across the country, often before they are being noticed by wider audiences. And one of the things I'm curious if you could talk about, the challenges are repeated, they are familiar across communities, but one of the things, and that some of this goes back to your own personal history, is the fact that while the challenges are repeated, and the challenges that you talk about across these stories aren't new, that the hurdles to dealing with the challenges seem to be different and to be new.
And they just get worse and worse.
And worse and worse. And particularly, your own personal story, when you then go back to your hometown
right.
to look at what's happening.
Yeah, I did not want to write a third book about the opioid crisis. I wrote Dopesick, which was about the problem, Raising Lazarus, which was about the solutions. Not as many people read that one. And I think there's a lot of opioid fatigue out there. But I go back and I want to tell the stories of what happened to my hometown. Why is it such a poorer, less educated, and angrier place? Why is a town that was a hub of abolition movement and lost more per capita Union soldiers than other towns its size, and has a Union soldier monument in the town square, and was a celebrated place on the Underground Railroad. Why am I now seeing Confederate flags? So I started noticing that in the late teens. At the same time, I started noticing my brother-in-law wanting to fight with me about politics and being deplorable. And then my brother, who had always driven to, I live in Roanoke, Virginia, driven to Roanoke to see our youngest child in High School Musicals, missed one. And it was one where Sasha was the lead. He was Nathan Detroit in Guys and Dolls. And I'm like, buddy, what happened?
Yeah.
I was expecting you. And he goes, oh, I didn't get the invitation because I unfriended you on Facebook because of all the liberal shit you post. Yeah, and I'm like, I post fact-checked articles, usually from the Washington Post or the New York Times. Some of the articles are my articles. And believe me when I say they're fact-checked. I mean, sometimes the Times will put a fact-checker, some Yale-educated young person who spends 3 days, it's like getting a brain colonoscopy. Like you're like, my mom's name is Sarah, they want to see her birth certificate. Like, it's really in-depth fact-checking, and people don't understand. And I had the same argument with one of my dearest friends, Joy, and I was she said, the media is just like, I hate the media. And I said, Joy, I'm the media. And I told the story about, you love me, don't you still love me? And she did my mom's funeral. She took me to school every single day. Her parents were both teachers, and they were from a much more middle-class educated world than my family was from. And they were part
when your
of
mom is in hospice.
Yeah. But at one point, Joy says, well, who fact-checks the fact-checkers? And she later apologized for that, but it seemed like there was no reaching her. And then the pinnacle moment, as you say, is my mother is on her deathbed in hospice, and it happens to be the Saturday after the 2020 election. And I'm sitting bedside with my evangelical sister, who had never previously said much political, and the hospice nurse's phone blings, and she goes, they're calling it for Biden. And my sister, who we were just having a pleasant conversation, we were telling mom stories and holding her hand, and she's gonna die. You don't know, she's gonna die on Tuesday and it's Saturday, but it feels like she could die at any moment because she's breathing really really like, and my sister says, you wait, it's fraudulent, he won't win. And so I was just like, wow, when mom goes, what's gonna be left of this? My brother's unfriended me, deplorable, you wait, he won't win, as mom's dying. And mom's the glue. Mom's always been the glue. Mom is the hero of this book. She's like gritty and feisty, and she's one of the heroes. And so I wrote this piece for the New York Times. It ran on Christmas Eve of 2020, and they left it open for comments for about an hour, and there were hundreds of comments of the exact same story. And so I didn't feel so all alone, but also I thought, this is another trend that people aren't noticing.
Right.
And now we know that 1 in 5 Americans is estranged from their family because of politics. We know, just because a poll that just came out a couple of weeks ago, that 64% of Americans think polarization and division is our main problem. It's a bigger problem even than the economy, and it keeps us from solving any of our other problems. And so I decided to undertake this 2-year homegoing project where I would drive to Urbana, I would rent an Airbnb, sometimes I would stay with a friend, sometimes I would stay with my sister, and I would just report the heck out of the changes that had taken place in the 40 years since I had left. So a third of the book is my story. A third of the book is the story of a young me who was a promising but poor kid named Silas. And a third is kind of just a look at the educational infrastructure and the institutions that once grounded the town and made it a great place for a poor kid like me to thrive and be ready to go to college at the sort of the last gasp of the war on poverty, in which it was possible for a poor kid like me to go 4-year college. I went to Bowling Green State University, and it was totally free because a Pell Grant then covered tuition, room and board, books, And even I had work-study jobs for pizza and beer, like everybody else. So that was key. And that doesn't exist. College has gone up, the government has underfunded higher ed to such extent, and the college price has tripled, and a Pell Grant only pays about 30% of a state college tuition now. So we basically, I mean, my editor was really shocked at this. I kind of knew that was happening because I used to teach at a community college for a brief period in the late 90s. I kind of saw it happening then and saw how Pell Grant students were being treated. And at the exact moment when we should have been buttressing the trades, we should have been encouraging people to go to college, we took it away. And I mean, that's what we're paying for now.
And you can see, again, the hurdles, what were lower barriers that allowed you to have the life and the career that you had coming from the very same place. All of a sudden, as you're reading about Silas, you see the barriers set even higher and higher and higher and higher.
Yeah. And I always think I had one stable parent. My dad was an alcoholic and was pretty dysfunctional by the time I was a teenager. My mom worked, kept the roof over her head. My grandma owned the house we live in. She lived next door. And, but Silas had no stable parents. He lost a parent to an overdose. His mother was in and out of prison on drug-related charges. For a time, he lived with a caregiver, a family friend who molested him for 3 years. And the reason I picked him, because I went around like reporting, talking to teachers and counselors, I said, I want a poor but promising kid. And everybody said, this kid, you have to interview Silas. And I loved the story because he was the drum major of the marching band. And I was the leader of the marching band too. We didn't have drum majors then, but I was the president and, you know, very active. And both of us saw our band directors as father figures, and Lord knows band kept me out of a heck of a lot of trouble. And when I go back and speak in my hometown, I always say, y'all are only here because you can't believe I'm not in jail, because I was pretty wild. And and to see Silas, I mean, his band director's name is David M. Sapp, and in his phone he's entered as David M. Dad, and he would spend every single lunch period in the band room getting counseling from this band director. And so there's still some really great teachers, but what they're dealing with now isn't so much, we don't have a way to send poor kids to college. It's like, we don't even have a way to get them to come to school. So one of the main characters in the new book is the truancy officer who puts 115,000 miles in a few years on her vehicle running from one end of the county to the other. And I mean, that'll curl your toes just to see what she's dealing with. And the fact that the state of Ohio, which has been gerrymandered and is a very solidly red state now, where once it was purple, has deregulated homeschooling, which means that the parents who aren't well enough, and largely that's because of the opioid crisis, to get their kids up for school in the morning, will now say that they're homeschooling in order to avoid truancy charges. And that was a total surprise to me.
Wow.
And just the amount of, you know, we now have 3 generations of folks who are suffering because of this, and they're turning to drugs not because of a doctor's prescription, as what happened in the early days of the opioid crisis, but due to the trauma of growing up with opioid-addicted parents.
And do you think about these big topics that you've taken on, and not only each book points to these big issues, but you can see the threads woven through all of them, all of these issues woven together. Do you think about these books as a trilogy?
I do. I said that in an interview not long ago, because it's so funny, like that last interview I did in Martinsville, like I was starting to see, and I interviewed the head of the NAACP, who was just a great character in Factory Man, and her family had worked for the factories for many years, and quite a community leader, and just an amazing woman. And earlier, the last time I interviewed her, she's like, yeah, I was accosted at CVS because somebody wanted me to go in and buy Sudafed, so they could make methamphetamine. They wanted to pay me $100 to go buy a bunch of Sudafed. And then I started hearing about people's houses being broken into so they could steal Xanax or Oxy to sell on the black market. And that was a way that, they could take them to assuage their trauma, but also they could resell it on the black market, and that would make up for the fact that they no longer worked at Bassett Furniture.
Right, right. So all of these pieces are interconnected.
Yes.
When you, again, thinking about these issues, the way that they have affected your own life, the way that you have seen them as you've reported on them, and we are talking about the ties that bind. I'm curious, just going back to your family and the challenges you're talking about there, how have you been able to start to move beyond the back and forth about deplorable and the political issues that have driven a wedge, and with your mom gone because she was the glue, what's the way forward? We were talking a little bit about, you were recently with some students and it's like, Thanksgiving's coming, got to go home to my family, don't know how we're going to deal with the Thanksgiving meal.
Yeah.
How do you all deal with the Thanksgiving meal?
Well, the great thing is about, like, you sell a book proposal, you get in advance, you do your job, even though you're not reporting to your boss every day like I did at the newspaper. But I basically self-assign myself to go home for a week, a month, every month. And I would have never done that on my own, right? And sometimes I would rent an Airbnb, and sometimes by day 4, I would just be so sad. And I would have to go home to my husband and my dog and my friends that think exactly the way I think. And somebody asked me in an interview, what was the predominant emotion? And I had to say it was pain to see my town like this and my relatives like this. But before I went, I did a lot of interviews. I talked to social scientists and rural education experts and therapists about how you bridge these conversations. I interviewed people that do this Braver Angels group that does division work.
Yeah.
And
we did one yesterday.
oh, amazing.
Yeah.
And one of the things they said was, well, don't go home and talk to your sister Cookie, the one who, it's fraudulent, you wait, he won't win. Don't talk about politics with her. Find out who you are as people again. And I mean, that was great advice. And I had this 2.5 hour interview, and it all went great. And it went so well that at the end, I said, I was thinking about my son who was about to marry his longtime boyfriend, and no one in my family had congratulated me or anything. And I said, Cookie, Max thinks you don't like him because he's gay. And she just turned and she said, I don't like that he's gay. I love him. And then all my bridge building went out the window. All my strategies for like listening, deep canvassing, listening, mirroring back what they're saying, but in like the nicest possible language, asking permission to speak before you jump in. It just went out the window. My face turned red, and we went this ugly back and forth, interrupting each other. And at the end, I said, well, I guess I won't invite you to the wedding. And she said, well, I guess I wouldn't come. And that hurt. Now, I kept saying, Cookie, he's happy. Don't you want him to be happy? And she would say really awful things like, I thought I was happy too when I was running around with every Tom, Dick, and Harry. And I was like, he's not running around with anybody. He's with this one beautiful person who has a great job. You've never met him. He's nice, all this kind of stuff. And then finally, I thought of Mr. Rogers. And
so all the other tools went out the window, but Mr.
you
Rogers.
can always come back to Mr. Rogers, who said to use your words. And I said, Cookie, I'm getting really mad. And she was getting mad too. And I said, if we're going to have any relationship at all, I don't think we can talk about this. And yet, before I left, she was asking me a question about Max when he was little. I said, well, if you remember when he was little, he loved The Wizard of Oz. He had my college roommate, who was a preschool teacher, make him red ruby slippers, and he wore them to preschool. And the preschool teacher was fabulous about it. And, there he is in the class picture in the front row wearing red ruby slippers. And she said, did he get made fun of? And I thought, oh, she's curious. That's a little crack of empathy, because she remembered that. She remembered those red ruby slippers because we would go home and visit more then. And in the last 5 years of my mom's life, my son, Max, wouldn't go home to see her because he was afraid he would run into Cookie, and he knew what her politics were, and that I'll have to go off, he said, if she says anything. And believe me, Max can go off. So it was better for all of us if he didn't. But I'm sad that he went to the funeral, but he didn't see his grandma in the last years of his life. And it was a while before I put all that together, that was why. And I just think about all the loss. And, she never met Zach, and she never will. She quotes Leviticus, it's an abomination. And that's really hard to bridge.
Yeah.
We're still in touch.
Yeah.
She came to my book event in Urbana.
Right, which is a way forward, a step forward.
It's something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The family loss is obviously so deep and so painful, and I know so many people are dealing with that, and that is a challenge, not to mention the neighbors and the people at work, and how do you deal with that? Another element to the loss, and we talked about this a little bit, or another piece of the problem, is the lack of knowledge, the fact that we don't know a lot about what's happening to others. One of the things we've talked about is this loss of local journalism.
Yeah.
And in fact, at the Karsh Institute, we recently did a big ecosystem study, and some of the information that we have found, about just looking at the Commonwealth of Virginia and what local journalism outlets exist here, the dearth of them here, and simultaneously the fact that people trust local journalism more than they trust the national media. Simultaneously, they're getting their information, including their political information, from social media, and they don't believe the social media outlets that they're relying on. So we've got this paradox, and I'm wondering, as you work in this industry, as you see these challenges, do you see a way forward for local journalism that allows us to tell the stories, to do the reporting, so that you have more stories about Selena, that you have more stories that bind communities together, as a way to help on the broader community level?
Yeah, I think there's some really great models for nonprofit journalism and online outlets, but as I said before, it still isn't near enough. We need better funding. In Germany, for instance, public media, the media is funded by the government. And we got out ahead of our skis on technology in the 90s when we didn't regulate it, so that Facebook isn't responsible for lies that get shared on its platform. If it knowingly allows sharing of false information, it should be liable for that. And I know people like Ro Khanna and others have tried to introduce legislation, but it hasn't gone anywhere, because look at all the billionaires in the country that own these websites, right? That Bezos and Zuckerberg and all this, and we know that lies spread on social media 6 times faster than the truth. That's MIT study, and I want to see your study. So it becomes possible in a place like Urbana. I come in, I spend 2 years, I'm not only getting these great personal stories, but I'm also looking at hard data. I'm looking at, and I'm astonished by the fact that the graduation rate has dropped 12 points in the last decade, or that I'm really trying to compare we've got a call for Q&A. I'm really trying to compare what it was like when I left 40 years ago versus what it's like today, and I'm astonished by my research into just the number of mental health emergency calls has multiplied by a factor of 9 in 40 years. And 911 calls go up 3 to 5% every year. So when my friends, who are mostly in the professional class in Urbana, say, I've never seen evidence of any of this, I say, that's because you have 1.5 people reporting news in your community. So it's possible for, as one person near the end of the book says, Urbana is the country club set and it's the ghetto set, and neither knows what the other is doing. And that's exactly what it is. And so some people are quite testy with me about, because this is news to them. They don't know these, they don't even know that the graduation rate's lower or that a lot of people are sending their kids to another district.
Well, and you reminded me, I was so engrossed I hadn't paid attention. We're going to go to Q&A in just a few minutes, so please look at the screens, send in your questions, and we will take those in a second. But Beth, I'm curious, we've talked about what you've done on a very personal level with your family. We have talked about your ideas around local journalism and how vital it is. I'm wondering if you can talk about things that we all might consider that we can do to try and knit ourselves together, whether it's reknit or knit for the first time,
Would it be
ourselves
okay if
together.
I read that
please.
section? So I have a section near the end, and it's a response to, I covered the county fair, which, you know, I had covered as a college intern. The county fair has been going on in Urbana since 1842. And the day before I was there reporting on it, a cop from another district was arrested for open carrying at the fair, and there's signs up saying you can't carry a gun into the fair. And so the day we were there, the Ohio Gun Owners Association shows up with an even bigger gun and purposely gets arrested so that they can lawyer up and sue the county fair board for the, you know, the Second Amendment. They thought that was a violation of their Second Amendment. And so they actually win that lawsuit. But in the meantime, I'm following the Ohio gun owners, and they're putting all this stuff out on Facebook saying, this is in the run-up to the race between Kamala and Trump and Harris and Trump. And they're saying, eat red meat, train daily, ammo up for the end times, repeat. There's a few more items in there, but it ends with repeat. They're basically saying war is coming, right? And especially if Kamala wins. So I felt like I have this writer friend, Robert Geit, who's an Appalachian novelist, and he always reads my books early, and he always says, you're such a good reporter, stop reporting and tell me what you think. Like, you've earned the right, just tell us what you think. Stop reporting. So I wrote this in response to Robert always tells me what to do for the end. I say, years ago, an addiction scholar I interviewed told me something I thought of every time I set foot in my home. She said, rigid thinking is a trauma response. Rigid thinking propelled by decades of job losses alongside pill mills to pacify the wounds, creating more billionaires and a growing underclass of people grappling with sky-high ACE scores or trauma levels. Rigid thinking culminating in the widespread normalization of obfuscated greed. If that little girl in the lilacs poring over the library's copy of Harriet the Spy, which was my favorite childhood book and the reason why I'm a writer, if she can go to college and have nice things, won't that just make it harder for my own kids to get ahead? It won't. The answer to poorly performing public schools isn't to pull out all the high achievers and segregate them in another district from the stragglers. It's to strengthen the most fundamental unit of a democratic society, our public schools. The answer to our epidemic of loneliness isn't to seek solace in conspiracy theories, which are all over the place in Urbana. It's to participate in real life with other human beings, including those we don't know. And so then I do like my own meme with a nod to the Ohio gun owners. May I suggest that we instead touch grass, take a walk with a friend, buy diapers for a nonprofit dedicated to serving low-wage moms, help mutual aid groups led by people in struggle. Where it is safe to do so, and I should have underlined and bolded that, try to mend frayed connections by practicing grace. As Barbara Kingsolver said, love stays alive if you tend it like a flame.
That's beautiful.
Support local news. Run for local office and or support candidates who are trying to change things for the better for the most people. Repeat. And so that's kind of like my call to action for the reader. And, you know, on President's Day in Roanoke, they had a rally for democracy. And after that, somebody said, we should do it every Monday. So every Monday at noon, we meet outside of our Congressman Ben Klein's office, who won't hold a town hall, who won't meet with us, and has never shown his face. We actually had an AI town hall with him once using all of the things he had said and written, which was hilarious. And then you wouldn't believe what's come of it. Like, we have these teach-ins where we bring in nonprofits after the rallies at the library next door to talk about how they're being impacted by the DOGE cuts and the oncoming Medicaid disaster that's coming, and our health insurance is all going to double next year. And we talk about how to help groups like the literacy volunteers and the Huddle Up Moms, the diaper bank. And somebody said, why don't we, instead of just rallying and talking about, why don't we bring food for the food pantries that are being hurt by the USDA cuts that happened during DOGE? And what you have is like a couple hundred, 300 people some weeks. They're mostly young retirees. They're the people who can afford to come out at noon on a Monday. They've never protested in their lives, but they're protesting for democracy. And it's really wonderful. And cool things are happening from it, all these tentacles. We brought in authoritarian scholar Andrea Pitzer, who wrote a wonderful book called One Long Night, and is a dear friend of mine from DC, and right after the election, and she told us we need to make the different parts of our lives connect. So, you know, we all have our different groups, but need to begin to stitch them together to repair this tattered quilt. And that's what it feels like the Monday rallies are in Roanoke for my community. And it's been great. And another takeaway was work this into your weekly routine. So, you know, friends of mine and I, we go and we pack Narcan kits every Monday afternoon, and there's a retired doctor that comes and she does wound care for the people with substance use disorders who have, you know, wounds in their arms. And it's all these people I don't know. And one day she said, she looked up and we're putting the Narcan in the little packages, and she said, isn't this a lovely way to spend time? And it really is.
Well, I remember you were telling us about that, and it was also beautiful. You said, I'm in the room with all these people I don't know, and I don't know what they think or what they believe, but we're all here doing something together.
Yeah, just
really
like the
beautiful.
diaper wrapping. Like,
Yes.
that shouldn't be a red or blue thing. It's like, can't we agree that all babies deserve to have diapers?
Right. Well, I want to take questions from the audience before we run out of time. So one of our students will stand up and, hi there, tell us who you are, tell the audience who you are, and then share the question, please.
Hi, thank you for being here. My name is Ariana McGurk. I'm a second year at the University of Virginia. I have a question for you on behalf of the audience. The question is, what advice do you have for people similarly from poor rural communities and who are pursuing higher education elsewhere who want to engage in the kind of storytelling that you're doing?
Like journalism students? Or?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, everybody can start a Substack, right? That was one of the things I did in the aftermath of the election when I was realizing that, oh my gosh, these DOGE cuts, how many people are going to lose their jobs at the VA? They ran a story. They didn't even say how many people were losing their jobs because they're so hamstrung by low staffing. So I started reporting on these things, and that's a pretty low barrier to start. And my Substack, if you want to follow me, you don't have to pay. It's called Beth Macy Substack, funnily enough. And so I just thought, what else am I doing? I'm getting ready for a book to come out. I can help. And that's an easy way to do it. There aren't as many outlets otherwise. You know, it's hard to get clips that help you get your first job. A lot of these outlets are laying off. If my own kid wanted to go into journalism, I'm not sure I would say you have to be exceptional to get hired these days. But these are things you can do on your own, and the young people I have met are amazing.
That's great advice. Do we have another question?
Hello, my name is Celia Calhoun, and I'm a fourth year at UVA. Our next question is, I found that it's incredibly easy for some to generalize about rural America. From your perspective, what are we getting wrong, and what are the nuances you wish more people understood?
Yeah, so people always ask me what I think of Hillbilly Elegy, and when I first read it, I thought, this is a decent book about a first-generation college student. I thought tonally at the end, he makes a wrong move when he's like prescribing what he thinks the answers are. And then I went out and I was reporting Dopesick, and every person in Appalachia was furious. And they said, Beth, he missed the whole systemic nature of what happened with the out-of-state coal companies that came in and the out-of-state pill mills and the Purdue Pharma, and he basically blamed the poor people of Appalachia for their own troubles rather than these things that the government allowed to happen, including globalization and the opioid crisis, right? And hundreds of years of this had been going on in Appalachia. And I was like, yeah, you're right. And at the time, Vance was saying, Trump was cultural heroin from America. And, he was actually at one point, he was going to move back to Ohio to fix the opioid crisis. And he started some foundation, and it didn't do anything because then he decided to become a politician. And I wrote a piece about we grew up an hour away from each other with very similar backgrounds. And I say, he was able to get out, but it wasn't just by the bootstraps, right? He had government help. He had a GI Bill. And of course, that was because he was in the military. And then he had, he went to Yale. And good on you, JD.
But all the supports that you were talking about earlier that are often necessary to help people make their way out that aren't
there. And even look
or
at the things,
not even out, but make their way so that they can be there and thrive, and communities can thrive.
Right. And you look at Silas, who has a full scholarship to a community college, which sounds great, right? He even has 2, but it only goes toward tuition so that his community college is an hour away. He needs a car good enough to drive 2 hours every day there and back. And he needs gas money. And those scholarships don't go towards any of that. So I watch him, he drops out the first week because the starter on his car, which is older than he is, blows. And then his mother gets in a wreck in another car, unrelated, gets a concussion and can't be left at home. And so he drops out his first week of school. He eventually gets back in the fall, but his family and the trauma of his family is constantly bringing him down. And it took him 5 clunker cars and getting away from his mother's house before he was finally able to finish that certificate program in welding. And he was great.
Doing so well, right?
He was the best welder in the, yes, he won an award.
I remember one story you talked about, because you talk about the transportation challenges often in rural America. One young woman had planned to ride her bike an hour and a half each way to go to school. I mean, these are...
She was about to get the same scholarship, and I said, Maddie, how are you going to get there? And I told her about Silas, and she said, well, there's that bike over there, and this had 2 flat tires, and it was rusted, and her brother was going to fix it up for her. And I said, honey, you can't ride an hour and a half, and Ohio's cold in the winter. She had ridden her little sister's scooter to her job at Burger King, which took her 45 minutes. These kids are bright, and they have so much. I just hate to see this potential go to waste in our country because of this backward thinking. Like a Pell Grant student, I have paid back that money they invested in me 100 times over. And a typical Pell Grant student pays it all back in 10 years. So it's so short-sighted.
I am afraid, looking at those big red zeros, that then I'm trying to ignore, but I can't, that we have run out of time. But before I thank you and ask the audience to thank you, I want to say to the audience, thank you so much for being with us for the past, whether you were here just with us today or the past 2 days or 3 days for Democracy 360. Your being here makes this vibrant and real. I want to thank all of our partners and our sponsors for their support. And I want to also thank the fantastic Karsh Institute of Democracy staff who have done a fantastic job, the students who have done a fantastic job. In particular, I'm thinking about Stephanie Jorgegas-Abbott, who's our program director, and Aaron Tor, our communications director, who have spearheaded this effort with the support of all of our colleagues at the Karsh Institute. And before I ask you to thank them, I want to turn to you, Beth, and say thank you so much to you for being with us, for giving us some sense of what we can do, how you have handled these challenges that so many people are grappling with, and what we can do to try and find the ties that bind us together. So please help me thank Beth.